No one could say exactly when CEO Toan disappeared. There was no breaking news, no dramatic farewell, no final message left behind. One day, he was simply there. His name mentioned in meetings, his presence felt in unfinished plans, and the next day, he was not. Silence took his place, quiet and unsettling, like a door left open in the middle of the night. For Tu Diem, the disappearance did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived slowly, disguised as ordinary days. She woke up, made breakfast, checked her phone, and told herself that being busy meant being patient. Morning after morning, she repeated the same routine, convincing herself that unanswered messages were only delays, that absence did not mean abandonment. Outside, life continued with impressive indifference. People rushed to work, vendors opened their shops, children argued over small things that would soon be forgotten. The world did not pause to ask where CEO Toan had gone. Only Tu Diem noticed the missing space he left behind, the empty chair, the conversations that never resumed, the promises that lingered without direction. At first, she defended him in her own thoughts. He must be overwhelmed. He must be dealing with something important. A man like Toan, successful and burdened with responsibility, surely had reasons. Yet, as days turned into weeks, certainty began to crumble. Concern grew heavier, slowly transforming into doubt. And doubt, once it settles in the heart, is difficult to silence. Was Toan truly missing, or had he simply chosen to step out of her life? The question haunted her in the quiet moments, while washing dishes, while waiting at traffic lights, while lying awake at night listening to the ticking clock. She realized how cruel unanswered questions could be. They offered no closure, only endless speculation. Friends spoke carefully, avoiding his name as if it were fragile. Some suggested patience, others suggested letting go. But Tu Diem found herself trapped between the two. Waiting felt loyal, letting go felt like betrayal, not only of him, but of the version of herself who had believed in shared tomorrows. And so, the story began not with Toan's disappearance, but with Tu Diem standing still, caught between hope and reality. In that stillness, a quiet truth started to form. Sometimes, the one who truly vanishes is not the person who leaves, but the one who remains, waiting for an explanation that may never come. If disappearance had a sound, Tu Diem thought, it would be the quiet hum of everyday life continuing without asking permission. The days after Toan's silence did not collapse into chaos. Instead, they moved forward with painful normality. Alarm clocks rang, traffic filled the streets, meals were cooked, eaten, and forgotten. And within that routine, Tu Diem learned how loneliness could hide behind ordinary gestures. She went to work as usual, smiled at familiar faces, answered questions that had nothing to do with her heart. On the surface, nothing had changed, yet inside, every small habit reminded her of him. She caught herself saving a seat that no one would take, buying food for two out of instinct, pausing mid-sentence as if expecting his reply. Absence, she realized, was not empty. It was crowded with memories. At night, the silence grew louder. Her phone lay beside her, screen dark, refusing to light up with the message she secretly waited for. She told herself she would not check it again. She'd checked it anyway. This quiet negotiation with hope became her daily ritual, one she never won. People around her tried to help in their own gentle ways. Some asked careful questions. Others avoided the subject entirely, believing silence to be a form of protection. But no one could give her the answer she needed, and without answers, waiting began to feel less like faith and more like punishment. There were moments when anger rose suddenly, surprising her. How could someone disappear so completely and leave behind such confusion? Then guilt followed just as quickly. What if something had happened to him? What if her doubt was unfair? These thoughts chased each other in endless circles, leaving her exhausted. As she walked home one evening, watching lights flicker on in other people's windows, Tu Diem felt an unexpected realization settle in her chest. Every house held its own story, unspoken arguments, quiet forgiveness, fragile hopes. Her pain was not unique, it was simply hers. And in that understanding, another question emerged, heavier than the first. Perhaps Toan had not truly disappeared from the world. Perhaps he had only disappeared from her life. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. Because if he had chosen to leave, then she was not waiting for his return. She was waiting to accept that she had been left behind. That thought frightened her more than his silence ever had. The decision to search did not come with courage, it came with exhaustion. One morning, Tu Diem woke up and realized that waiting had drained her more than walking ever could. Silence had begun to feel heavier than rejection, and uncertainty more painful than the truth. If Toan had vanished, she needed to know how far. If he had chosen to leave, she needed to know why. She began with places that still carried his shadow. Office buildings where his name once commanded attention now echoed with polite confusion. People lowered their voices when she asked about him, offering careful answers that said very little. Some claimed he was abroad, others said he had stepped away for personal reasons. No one seemed certain, and no one seemed surprised. That perhaps hurt the most. Her search led her beyond glass offices and formal hallways into ordinary spaces where life unfolded without ambition or titles. Construction sites where dust clung to shoes. Small cafes where workers drank coffee quickly before returning to unfinished tasks. These were places Toan used to visit, places where he had once spoken kindly, remembered names, promised progress. Now his presence existed only in vague memories. Each conversation followed the same rhythm, a question, a pause, a gentle shake of the head. Not recently, not anymore, I don't know. With every answer, hope rose briefly, then fell harder. The journey became a series of near misses, a map drawn with erasers instead of ink. By afternoon, her body protested. Hunger, ignored since morning, finally demanded attention. She sat on a low step outside a small shop, sipping cheap tea and watching strangers pass by. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve. A delivery man counted coins twice before leaving. Life continued, unbothered by her quiet crisis. And in that moment, Tu Diem felt strangely small, one woman searching for meaning in a world too busy to notice. As evening approached, doubt returned, sharper than before. What if this search was only prolonging the pain? What if the truth, once found, would offer no relief? Yet turning back felt impossible. She was no longer searching only for Toan, she was searching for herself, the woman who had believed, waited, and now dared to ask questions. And somewhere along the road, between tired steps and unanswered calls, Tu Diem understood that this journey was changing her. Whether she found Toan or not, the act of searching had already begun to break the silence he left behind. Night arrived without ceremony, settling over the city like a long sigh. Tu Diem returned home with tired steps, carrying nothing in her hands and too many thoughts in her heart. The search had ended for the day, but the questions had not. They followed her through the doorway, sat beside her as she removed her shoes, and lingered in the quiet spaces of the room. She made herself a simple meal, eating slowly, tasting little. Across the street, a family laughed over dinner, their voices drifting through an open window. Somewhere nearby, a television played a familiar drama. Ordinary sounds, ordinary lives. And suddenly, Tu Diem understood how invisible heartbreak could be. The world did not announce loss. It simply expected people to keep living. Later, she sat by the window, watching the lights of passing cars blur into soft lines of motion. Once, she had imagined sharing moments like this with Toan, quiet evenings, unspoken comfort, the kind of closeness that required no words. Now, the silence felt different. It was no longer waiting to be filled, it was asking to be understood. She thought about everything she had done since his disappearance, the waiting, the searching, the defending of his absence, the quiet anger she never voiced. And in that reflection, a painful clarity emerged. Perhaps Toan had not disappeared from the world at all. Perhaps he had simply moved forward, while she had stayed behind, holding on to a version of the past that no longer existed. The realization hurt, but it also freed her. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a life that did not revolve around his return. Not because she stopped caring, but because caring alone could not carry her any further. Before going to bed, Tu Diem turned off the lights and stood in the darkness for a moment. She whispered nothing, made no promises, asked no questions. Some endings, she realized, did not come with explanations. Some stories ended quietly, leaving the meaning to those who remained. As she lay down, sleep came slowly but honestly, and in that fragile peace, one truth settled gently within her. Whether CEO Toan had disappeared or not, no longer mattered as much as she once believed. What mattered was that Tu Diem had chosen not to disappear with him. The night closed around her, calm and unresolved, just like life.